All right, so this unit we are starting off with looking at life in medieval towns, and this video is going to be about guilds, trade, and homes in medieval towns. So to recap town life, as Europe became more organized and safer, towns began to grow. So that's kind of a result of the feudal system stabilizing Europe. Towns began to grow, become more populated, more stable. Early towns in the Middle Ages were part of a manor, like the town in the movie Castle, where it's run by a lord, managed by a lord. And as towns become more successful and wealthy, they were able to purchase their freedom from their lords by buying a charter. So a charter is like a document, and what towns would do is they would send money to the king and ask him to grant them their independence so that they would be able to make their own laws, their own taxes, their own judgments, or act as judges. So they didn't want to depend on a feudal lord anymore. So we start to see lords kind of losing their power in the Middle Ages because towns were becoming independent. And again, that was called a charter. Guilds were also a big part of medieval Europe, and craftsmen organized guilds. And these groups helped their members in many ways. And I want to clarify, craftsmen, again, are skilled peasants, so they would have one specific skill, like maybe they're a blacksmith or a tailor or a shoemaker, but they would have a specific skill. And guilds were groups of craftsmen who had the same skills. So there would be a blacksmith guild, and everyone in the guild would be a blacksmith. There would be a cobbler guild, and everyone in the guild would be a cobbler or a shoemaker. And so on and so forth. So you wanted to be a member of the guild because they helped their members. So one of the things that guilds did is they set work hours and prices. So they made it so that you could only work a certain number of hours and you could only charge a certain amount for your goods. And that was to try to limit competition and make it fairer for every member of the guild. So you didn't have someone working like twice as many hours so they can make more goods and sell more goods and make more money. The guilds also set quality standards, so they made sure that their members were producing good quality materials and products. So if you were not producing high quality stuff, they would maybe kick you out or charge you a fine. So they would punish members who violated those standards. If you got injured or died, the guilds would support widows and orphans, and they would also help pay for funerals. Guilds also limited competition by deciding who could join. So you had to prove that you were worthy to be a member of the guild. So if you wanted to become a master, you would create a masterpiece. So if you're a blacksmith, maybe it was like a suit of armor, maybe it was a really fancy sword, and the guild would decide if you could join or not. And then if they decided you could join, you would also have to pay a fee. And sometimes that could be up to a year's worth of wages. So that would be really hard for people to join guilds. So it was kind of like an exclusive club with a lot of benefits. Boys started training for a craft at age 12. So kind of similar to the knights, you would start training to be a blacksmith or a baker or a cobbler or butcher at the age of 12, and you were called an apprentice, and you were not paid for that work. Girls could also be craftsmen as well, so they could also be apprentices. And when you're an apprentice, you're usually living with the family that you're working with and that you're learning with. So sometimes parents had to pay to get kids to be accepted as an apprentice because they would be like clothed and fed and housed by the family that they were working for. So that's going to cost some money. And then after about 7 years of training, they had to prove themselves by creating a masterpiece. So again, you have to train for 7 years and then you create a masterpiece. And remember, to become a member of the guild, you had to pay a fee, and sometimes people couldn't afford that right away. So if they couldn't afford to become a master, they became a journeyman and they hired themselves out. So they would travel around town or around the area, working and trying to make some money to save up to become a master and to have their own shop. Trading was often run by merchant guilds. So if you were trading, you would be a part of a merchant guild to help facilitate the trade of goods. And towns usually had markets to sell locally made goods. And then sometimes they would have a larger market called a fair, and they would sell goods that came from far away. And when we do skits next week, we'll kind of talk about what those markets look like. Fairs were only held a few times a year. We also start to see towns were surrounded by walls for protection, and they're usually pretty crowded. So if you think about the image that we looked at earlier this week, towns were pretty crowded. It's going to help the spread of disease. The poorer people in towns had homes that were like the peasants' homes, like 1 to 2 rooms, but wealthier peasants had nicer homes that were bigger and more comfortable, and sometimes they were 3 stories high with a shop on the first floor. And peasants start going to school, but only the wealthier peasants were able to send their children to school. So we start to see an increase in education. And last but not least, disease was a huge problem in medieval Europe, and you're going to watch a video on it later this week. So don't forget to print the notes after you've downloaded them from portals, and make sure you answer the 2 questions or the couple questions at the bottom of the notes, and be prepared to turn that in tomorrow.